Good morning, everybody. Nice to see you here. I have the pleasure to introduce this session with my colleague, Dilip Jester, and we will share the high responsibility to present the speakers. The first one will be Giselle Apter, professor as a child and adolescent and perinatal psychiatrist. She is professor of child psychiatry at University of Rouen in Normandy, France, and directs the child psychiatry at Le Havre Hospital in Normandy, as well as a research unit in perinatal and infant psychiatry and psychopathology. She is currently the president of la Société de l'Information Psychiatrique, which is a society of public psychiatrists in France. After having been the founding chair of the World Psychiatric Association, section on perinatal and infant mental health, she is now our WPA Western Europe zonal representative, I would say for at least 2 terms. Okay. She's particularly interested in the perinatal period and infancy, the impact of parental mental disorders on pregnancy and newborns, and has extensively published in this field. Her plenary address will be Psychotherapy in Perinatal and Child Psychiatry, an inescapable necessity, ? Thank you, Zia. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a kind introduction. And I want to say that given the broad topic of the talk, I sort of tried to insist on joint psychotherapy for in perinatal and infant, because going beyond would probably make it maybe a little longer than it is. It might be a little too long. I have a tendency to be a very perinatal and infant person, plus the fact that I come from different roots that are common, I think, with the Moroccan way of seeing things. And I want to thank Idriss Moussaoui and the organization for having invited me. And I think we prefer that there is still some food left on the table rather than being waiting for more. So there might be too many slides, but then I'll share the slides and that'll be okay. I do have some conflicts of interest in the sense that I believe that wherever you talk from, as was mentioned, I work in a public hospital, I advocate for public health, and that's from where I talk, and of course those are biases. I've also worked a lot on PPD, so. But today the question was, that we will try to at least enlighten and not answer, is there a mutual impact between psychiatric illness during pregnancy and postpartum, and what happens to the developing infant and child? And can those infants, toddlers, young children then be unfortunately affected and afflicted with mental health issues? And so if we have both to think of, which is a complicated issue for most health professionals, we have been taught and trained in my country, and I think in most countries, to think of the patient as one and only, and we are here with no one and only, with 2s and 3s, and I'll get back to that. So the outline of the talk, as quickly as I can, but still, and obviously this is an umbrella talk, and I can go into detail, give you my email at the end if some people would like to go on with the discussion once the talk is over, is maternal perinatal mental health, and you'll notice that I've translated women's issues into maternal because we are here during a specific period of time. Fetal, neonatal, and infant development, and it's not the same, fetus, neonate, infant. Maternal impact on this fetal FNID, on this fetal, neonatal, and infant development. The interactive development of what unfortunately becomes psychopathology, and how do we try to, some guidelines on how to care for both, general guidelines, not specific types of psychotherapy. So just as a reminder, and I have one of my, I should say, wonderful pastimes when I'm trying to think and be a little more creative than going through all the administrative work one does now in a hospital, is art and history of art. And so I'm sure you recognize some of the main issues in perinatal and women's health. This is La Salpêtrière, and what was used to be described as a terrible place for women, the first hospital for women, and obviously two women here who are in very disastrous situations. One is Jadie Buterne. She was Modigliani's wife, and she committed suicide when she found out that he was dead, and she was pregnant at the time, 7 months pregnant. So yes, suicide does exist even during pregnancy. And this is Guernica, and a PTSD afflicted mother who is holding a dead child. So yes, pregnancy does not protect from mental illness, neither does the peripartum, whether it be pre-existing or de novo. I'm sure all of you are aware of this, but it's a sort of, very quick reminder, and also a reminder that in psychiatry we're rightly focused on very severe mental illnesses like postpartum psychosis or chronic mental illness, but that a lot of publications are more interested in mild to moderate depressive illness, and much less, I have a slide, and believe me, it's like 50 times less, on what is the impact on peripartum. There's lots of stuff on PTSD, there's lots of data, and some specialists right here in this room in the front row on trauma and stress, but the impact of that on the fetus and the newborn and the first interactions is unfortunately much smaller. It's thankfully gaining momentum. So these pre-existing conditions and the de novo illness during the peripartum have a major impact. I won't go into that, but just so you know, and there's data, there's ample data, and women's mental health has developed more in the Anglo-Saxon world that has shown that. So what does this do to the fetal, neonatal, and infant when it is very, very young? Well, I'm not going, again, this slide is a sort of animated slide that I often use to show students specifically every single little discovery, which has become a big picture of everything that an infant is able to do, some of its capacities, cognitive, sensory motor, communicative, the idea that from birth, infants are ready and want to communicate. This was a revolution at the end of the 20th century in the minds of many psychotherapists and psychoanalysts. And all this, as you can see, is going on, and I'm only just showing you some of the major capacities of an infant before the age of 9 months, which is, to me, the second pregnancy. I mean, I know you're going to have a big talk on epigenetics. I don't know exactly what will be the content, but the idea is that actually when, physiologically infants, full-term infants are premature in the sense that the first 9 months are really a major brain sculpture moment, and everything that is interacted during these times is part of what is going to be then the developing infant brain. So what does maternal mental illness do to the pregnancy and the postpartum and the neonate? Well, again, just so that you understand why I put in these wonderful, extraordinary paintings. By the way, I have no copyright. They are not my personal private collection, unfortunately, but they are part of most European museums. This woman here looks alone, so why, and she's not pregnant, so why did I put her in here? Well, because she is the picture of postpartum depression and probably trauma. This is the cradle's rope that she is rocking, and obviously she is taking nurse care of the infant, but not preoccupied by the infant because she cannot be. She is preoccupied by her inner emotions. And obviously, we have here the picture of poverty and impossibility. take care of children in difficult social situations, and the risk when women give birth of, again, of death and therefore of major trauma for everyone. So just very quickly, so that you understand that every single severe mental illness has now at least had some very serious studies showing the important impact on the neonate, on the pregnancy, on high-risk pregnancies, on the risk for the child, for child development and cognition, and the long-term risk of these severe mental illnesses. It's true for bipolar disorder. It's true for MDD and PDD. These are the conditions that have had the largest number of studies and the longest longitudinal studies showing impact up to not only 3.5 or 5 years, but up to 18 years, and especially in boys and men, as we know, who are more fragile than women during the development. And of course, I will focus a little more on PTSD, history of abuse, trauma, and stress, because as I mentioned, and because it's my area of research, as I mentioned, there's much less going on, probably because it's messier, but the latest data, which was really made massive from Australia or the US, has shown that there is impact probably beyond 18 months now. Longitudinal studies are coming out around 5 years, and unfortunately, the impact is very negative without interventions. So why be interested in both of these and look at them together, as I mentioned at the beginning? Because, well, as was mentioned yesterday by the panel we were on child and adolescent psychotherapy, there's no such thing as a young infant. You might as well, you could say there is something as an adolescent, but still, the parents are in the background, and of course, during early development, you actually can see in this art a little sunnier, and probably would make people smile a little more, that infants are never alone. And actually, not only are they never alone, most of the time, even though what we study is face-to-face interactions, they are not face-to-face. They are not face-to-face because the role and scaffolding of parenthood is to help the child discover the world. But to be right behind or very close by in order to let the child discover the world safely. And this is, for me, the image of what secure attachment is. Secure attachment is not keeping your child close to you, is not making sure that nothing happens, that everything is smooth and sleek, and that everything will roll on and nothing no crying will occur, nothing will be messy. It's, as you can see, the road here is full of possibilities of falling, especially for a young toddler who's not yet well trained in walking and running. And the parent, one, is encouraging the child to go towards the second parent. You can't, given the age of the painting, it could be a boy or girl, they were all dressed the same, okay? But it doesn't matter. The idea is, probably this child is going to fall. This is hard to get past, okay? It doesn't matter. You have to learn to walk, and you have to learn to walk because this is the house they live in, so it's not going to change. But if you measure each of these two adults, and you measure the distance between the two, actually they can each plunge and catch the child before it really hurts itself. And that is secure attachment. You can go out and explore the world, and I'm right behind or I'm right in front of you, and I will catch you if something goes wrong, and otherwise I'm happy, and of course this is a beautiful environment, and it's spring, and everything is sunny, and so it puts you in a good mood. But that's the idea. The idea is interactions help shape the way the child will explore and master the world. And of course, as I mentioned, these interactions are strongly correlated to emotional development, and the interactions are more strongly correlated to what happens to the child than the issue of the parent having a psychiatric diagnosis per se. I mean, it's not, I have bipolar disease, my child will be like this, or I have severe recurrent depression. It's how do I interact with the child, and how do I ensure that this child becomes secure, or at least if insecure, organized insecure, and I'll get back to that. So how does that work? Very quickly. Well, it works because even if you just look at one, mother is sort of a generic, it could be father, and it could obviously be a foster parent. So it's a generic for, and it's because studies are essentially mother-baby studies. Again, it's a probably Western idea, and maybe a research idea, because as you saw, mostly babies are being presented to the world, but that's when everything goes well. And of course, they're interacting together, and they're regulating each other, but they're also self-regulating, which is what you're doing, which is what I'm doing right now. But essentially, adults self-regulate intuitively, and most of us are able to self-regulate, and we don't have to think about it. An infant, it's a lot more complicated, especially if it's less than 9 months old, and it has to regulate a lot, because there are a number of things that it still has not, its brain and its global system has not managed to do. So what does this look like when you look at it as time goes by? It means that we are interacting more or less happily, like this. We're matched, we think together, we're happy together, we have intersubjective emotions, and then of course, you know, something happens because life happens, and I sort of look away, the baby looks away, whatever, and so it gets messy and we're not connected yet. But since we were happy being connected, we're going to try to be connected again. And this goes on back and forth. And obviously, what really is important is reparation. And that is where probably psychotherapy, as we will see, might come in. And of course, this means that it's a whole system that is able to regulate the caretaker infant regulatory and emotional outcome. So, and obviously this means that then when things are okay and you repair more than you are mismatched, then you become essentially secure, and sometimes, there's something wrong with the next slide, never mind. You only become disorganized when this is not possible, and we'll get back to that again. So, unfortunately, something happened to the slide. But as you can see, everything is connected. And so how will we be able to intervene? Now, we actually want the whole system to evolve in a way that the mother be more sensitive to the infant, and the infant be able to develop better cues for the mother to understand, or have someone decode the infant's cues so that the mother can, or the parent, the caretaker, can adapt and attune to the infant better. That's actually what we do in psychotherapy or in combined treatments. But where does that work when you're looking at time as time goes by? Well, that means we're trying to heighten the quality, not always the quantity of match meaning and full meaning moments. And we are not necessarily trying to discard moments of mismatch. What we are trying to do is to actually act on repair. Why are we trying to act on repair? Because after messiness? Because, as I said when I showed that beautiful painting, the idea is not that it's not going to get messy. The idea is that every time it gets messy, we know how to deal with it. And maybe because we're not in the same place here as we were here, we are going to be able to create something better than what was before, or something that will include the infant's development, because you can look at this as a few minutes time interaction, or you can look at it as in a more developmental way, and you have to input everything that I showed you from 0 to 9 months that the infant is rapidly developing into. And this means that you then obviously are actually impacting, again, the whole system. Why do we need to do this? Now, is this just this sort of theoretical model that's been working pretty well in research for the past, I'd say at least 50 years? No, well, which is already not bad, I mean. But also because data shows, for example, using the still face-to-face procedure that I know most of you know, the mother and baby are face-to-face, and then you tell the mother after a few minutes to make a poker face, to be still, not move, and not respond to the infant. And then after between 90 and 120 seconds, they act again. And so this is part of the research I've been working on for now years and years. What do we find if we just look at one aspect, which is generally something that seems very important to everyone, which is how infants gaze. As you know, we try. It's a very important element when one is looking at how the infant is able to communicate even from birth. Can it follow a gaze? Can it follow my hand? Will it look at me, or is it avoiding my gaze? Which is a very important sign in psychiatry and psychopathology. Well, when you look at, these are two groups of babies with mothers with or without trauma, complex, borderline, insecure, dorsal organized attachment, I mean, whichever way you want to define it, but that's the group that is red, and the group that is blue has no psychopathology, control group, no depression, nothing. And actually, this might look different, but it's not. Statistically, it's not different. There's a trend, but it's not different. And actually, students were wondering, well, it's not different, and not only isn't it different, actually the babies of traumatized mothers look at their mothers more. Isn't this better? Well, it's not better because when mothers, we'll see why it's not better, but because there's no better, but this is baseline. So what happens after the still face is actually the infants that were looking more at the mother look less at the mother. They can't stay on the still face. It's even worse than the control babies, even though we all know that babies do not like a still face. I mean, that's been shown time and time again. And so what happens when they play again? Sorry, wrong. Well, they sort of both go back to looking at their mothers, and there's really no difference, you can see that, but less than they were at the beginning. Now, why is this important? Because actually, that's not what we're doing in real life. What we're doing in real life is looking at the whole thing, right? So we're looking at what's happening in a few minutes. My mother's playing with me, and then, I don't know, the phone rings. My elder brother has spilled yogurt all over the place. My mother's just going to do something else. Not necessarily be a still face, but she's not going to be responding to me, okay? So that's not fun, but actually, when she does respond again, might take her a little while to get back to where we were, but we rapidly can get back to where we were. If my mother is a traumatized person, we're never going to get back to where we were, not in a decent lapse of time. And that's the issue. The issue is little things of life that happen to every single mother and baby will not have the same impact on an infant and that has a unfortunately traumatized or borderline or history of abuse, etc. mom. And we probably would be better off, and will be my closing remark in about 2 minutes, probably better off trying to get this back looking like this rather than trying to fix the baby or the mom. Because what we want is a dynamic way of the baby to move forward, and we want a dynamic way for the parent to be able to adapt sensitively to the infant, even though it's going to take many, many years, unfortunately, and sometimes even it will never heal because of their own history, and that's very sad. but the infant cannot wait. I had a video just showing you how, but I think given there's only 5 minutes left, well, maybe I can just show you something you might have a hard time seeing. The mother is tickling the baby a lot, and the baby is really looking at her. And, I don't know if you can hear her, you heard her hiccup. She says,
oh, okay.
You have the hiccups, right? You have the hiccups. Okay? And what's going to happen once a baby has the hiccups? What you're supposed to do when a baby has the hiccups? You probably need to sort of lower your level of stimulation, right? Sorry. But what this mother does, I'm sorry, this mother does, is go on. And you can still hear the hiccup.
Oh, t'as le hoquet. T'as le hoquet. T'as le hoquet, bébé.
It's a few seconds.
Bravo.
Look at what she's doing.
Bravo.
Do this.
Bravo. Bravo.
And you see the baby's face turning slightly away?
Non,
And the mother anticipates. She says, no, no, don't cry. Of course, I'm not going to traumatize you. Baby cries a lot. And then the mother says, what's wrong with you? Is your stomach hurting? So she grasps, she has no cognitive delay, she has no, she sees the infant's cues, but she cannot act upon them. And this is not her first child, by the way, so it's not that she just doesn't know what to do. This is a 3-month-old baby. It is because she is so eager to have the baby communicate with her, because she is so afraid of not being able to communicate with her baby, that she stimulates the baby constantly, and this baby is pretty competent, so it works up to a certain point, and then it gets dysregulated, and then all goes to kingdom come. So, what should we be doing? Because this is the end of the talk. We should be thinking in 2s and 3s, in the sense babies, mothers, fathers, parents, both parents, but therapists and professionals, in terms of each one's needs, but also in terms of the needs within the interaction. And of course, these are high-risk situations. Regulated interactions support organized attachment. It's not always secure. Most of these children, we followed them up and did strange situations with them, and even looked at them at school age and at their attachment representations. And most of them were not secure, but they were not all, they were less disorganized, and there's an ongoing study that shows that interventions lower by half the number of disorganized attachments in children when you intervene before the age of 1. So with both parents, by the way, with parent and child, or both parents if you have both parents, which you don't always have on hand. So I think these are first line. We have to think about the way of helping professionals to be able to address both infants and parents. I want to thank you. I can't do any of this without my team. We have a mother-baby unit, we have an ambulatory daycare unit, we have an outpatient clinic, and both my researchers, that some of you know, have been working with me for, these two for years and years. They keep young by just working with babies, but yeah, years and years. And I think we need to be creative and not just look at one part of the picture. And maybe we can dream of something better for the children of this world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giselle, for this great presentation and the wonderful videos. It's amazing to see these young children. I remind a good memories from one of my child psychiatrist colleagues who said to me, you know, we are seeing our young patients too late. Sometimes they are already 2 years old. And as adult psychiatrists, I was feeling sad because we are meeting our patients much later than that. So thank you again. Have you questions maybe for Giselle? We have time? Yeah, go ahead. Microphone.
Thank you for a great presentation. My question is from the point of view of primary prevention of schizophrenia. Are there data showing that if we provide the best prenatal, natal, and postnatal care, the incidence of schizophrenia will drop?
No one knows. For sure, one of the issues with major severe mental illnesses, because for the moment the data is terrible. I mean, the rate of risk, at least for few longitudinal studies we have, which are not very good methodologically, because really hard, show very high rates of schizophrenia in offspring of people with schizophrenia. However, we have no knowledge of how well they were treated during pregnancy. We don't have, there's even a hard time having a consensus on how to treat during pregnancy. I'm not talking about psychopharm rules. That's already tricky, but at least we have rules. But you know, what is being stabilized during a pregnancy, because you have to follow pregnancy really carefully. Sometimes seeing a patient like that every month is not enough. And so, you know, you need the resources, you need special services. And the fact that obviously after birth, you again have to readapt totally, both the treatment and the support. And the infant may have withdrawal symptoms because you can't avoid that. We have, with the mother-baby unit, that's what we see. And so you actually need extra services and extra support for these children. Plus, obviously, there is weight of biology and genetics. But it's not, as we know, it's not direct. So I think if we could find funding for a good longitudinal study, as you know, longitudinal studies are hard to get funded, I think it would be really interesting, or at least pool together places who have good data on how these women were treated and what happened in the first year, for example, of postnatal care. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's now time to go further. And I would like to introduce our colleague Vincenzo Di Nicola. Not easy to introduce Vincenzo, because to my knowledge, he is a kind of great humanist. Just to say you something. Vincenzo Di Nicola is an interdisciplinary scholar who trained as a psychologist, child psychiatrist, psychotherapist, and philosopher. He practices and teaches in Montreal, Quebec, and consults internationally in the areas of child and family psychiatry, trauma, social and cultural psychiatry. He is tenured professor of psychiatry at the University of Montreal, Canada, and has many other duties in that academic field. He received many awards, I don't list them, and his research ranged from behavioral psychology to child psychopharmacology and psychiatric epidemiology. His most recent volume, with someone called Drostoy Stoyanov, Psychiatry in Crisis, at the Crossroads of Social Sciences, the Humanities and Neuroscience, was very recently published. His plenary address is Take Your Time, thank you for that, 7 lessons for young psychiatrists. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Ferrero. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much to this wonderful organization for inviting me. And I follow another child psychiatrist and with great interest in maternal-child interactions, and it's something very close to my heart. Thank you very much. I wish we had more time to talk about it. So I'd like to share with young people, young therapists especially, lessons for young therapists from a lifetime of doing various forms of psychotherapy. You already know a little bit about me. Let's get right into my talk. So take your time. So with these 7 lessons for young therapists in what I would call this technocratic time of pressure and speed, I commend young therapists eager to embrace change and to make a difference in the world to take your time. Now that's very ironic coming from me because people think of me as a fast person. I speak quickly, and I'm part, so maybe the lesson is for myself. So by opening a space for reflection by every party in the therapeutic encounter, the possibility of an event, something surprising, unpredictable, and new may emerge from the therapeutic situation. So these lessons integrate my work in psychiatry and psychotherapy with my slow thought manifesto and my call for slow therapy. So we've already heard about some of the work I've done. So let me get to the first lesson. The first lesson for young therapists is people come into therapy in order not to change. And the question underneath all that is, what is the task of therapy if people come into therapy not to change? So Freud called this resistance. I resist the concept of resistance because I think it's too negative. And it's also the 19th century language of material science. Think about that, stress, resistance, even resilience. These are from material science, about tension and compression. Systems theory, which was a re-founding of what I would call a relational psychiatry, and that's the basis of systemic family therapy, called this homeostasis. In other words, a system seeks an equilibrium, seeks to stay the same. And most of us are like that. So what is the task of therapy if people come into therapy not to change? Well, Freud wrote that the task of psychoanalysis is to make the unconscious conscious, working through resistance. I have a different take on it. I think the nature of therapy is to give structure and meaning to the predicament, a morally charged situation, and I purposely chose a word that's not impregnated with the jargon of psychology, psychiatry, and psychotherapy. The predicament of an individual, a couple, or a family, a group, or even a community. And why do we do this? The exploration of predicaments is done in therapy when it is not possible elsewhere or otherwise. I work with children. I have more problems than the children I see, including mental problems, relational problems. The difference is I have more resources. So the issue is not that we do therapy because we have a problem. The issue is we don't have the resources to solve our problems. So I get it through my colleagues, through my friendships, through love, through my children, through my mentors. And this is exactly what's missing often in the lives of the people that come for help. So one of the questions that was asked to me, is often asked to me when I give talks or in our residency program or in medical school is, what's your read and where do you start? Well, read Freud first. Do not read about Freud, especially if you're young. Before you get contaminated and poisoned and envenomed against this strange character called Freud, read him for yourself. So start with The Interpretation of Dreams, which was published in 1900. It's a lie. It was published in 1899, but he was so forward-looking, he wanted the 1900 to be on the page. After Freud, read Winnicott's Playing in Reality. These are the 2 books, wonderful books. Winnicott was a pediatrician and psychoanalyst who worked with young children, and he coined the term the holding environment. And following the talk by my colleague Giselle Apter, this is a wonderful emblem of the mother-child dyad. Second lesson, therapeutic temperaments. Who conducts therapy and why? Why do people come into therapy? Why do we decide to do therapy? And I think the answer is related to therapeutic temperaments. I once did a review of the work of 4 members of the Milan team with whom I trained in family therapy. There were 2 women, 2 men. And what I noticed in the difference of the work after they broke up and working in different areas is the men had what I would call a technocratic temperament. They were asking questions like, how do you intervene? How do things work? And the women, notably Mara Salvini Palazzoli, my mentor, was interested in phenomenological questions, understanding. And they answer questions like, what are we dealing with and why does it happen? Now, Kurt Lewin was a social psychologist that was one of the founders of the Tavistock Institute in London, where I began my training in psychoanalysis. And he had a bridging concept between understanding and intervention. He said, if you want to truly understand something, try to change it. Third lesson, the family is a unique culture. I often ask the question, why do we still talk about systems? Systems is a distancing way that reminds me of, the era of computers when they used to fill entire rooms like this. The family is a unique culture, and we need a psychology that answers to that reality. So I want to share with you a wonderful quote from Natalia Ginsburg in her autobiographical novel called Family Sayings. There are 5 of us children. When we meet, we can be indifferent and aloof. But one word, one phrase is enough. One of those ancient phrases, heard and repeated an infinite number of times in our childhood, would make us recognize each other in the darkness of a cave or among a million people. These phrases are the foundation of our family unity, which will persist as long as we are in this world and which is recreated in the most diverse places on earth. So the family is its own culture. We live in many envelopes, and one of our envelopes is the family, and that is the crucible of socialization for children. Marisa Palazzoli said she wasn't so interested in phenomenology that she was as attached to using family therapy as an exploration of human experience as she was in creating technique. And she said in one of her books, family therapy is a starting point for the study of ever wider social units, which is, of course, shouldn't be a surprise that I would quote this, being a social psychiatrist. Salvador Minuchin is an interesting character. He was one of the founders of structural family therapy. He had trained at the William Allinson White Institute in New York, and after his training there in psychoanalysis, he said, psychoanalysis sees man, it's an old-fashioned way of talking about humanity, out of context. And it's a partial truth. It was a truth at the point, it was a punctuation at the time to talk about the need to expand psychoanalysis into a more relational view. Maurizio Andolfi, with whom I train also in Rome and with whom I collaborate, argues for a relational psychology and relational therapies that arise from that. And I think that's a very important point. Fourth lesson, I call it changing the subject. How does therapy work? So this is a cartoon where they're looking at a car, and the Freudian says, what's the nature of the trouble and when did it begin? And the behavior therapist says, let's drive it around and see what happens. So, technocratic, phenomenological. We need both. And the best therapists, I think, are a balance of both. But often, we start with one of the other temperaments. So how does therapy work? In my view, following the work of Bates and Gregory Bates, an anthropologist who really was a founder of family therapy in many ways, he looked at everything that's happening as information. So we do 3 simple things with the information that arises in the therapeutic context. We enhance uncertainty. For example, we might say to someone, that doesn't seem to be working out so well for you. So instead of comforting someone who says it's okay, which is a lie, things are not okay, you say, well, maybe things are not working out so well for you. Let's take a look at this. We introduce novelty. Maybe there's other ways to look at this, a new vision, a new view, a new thought. And finally, we encourage diversity. Let's try a different approach. It's not working for you. This is very close to what cognitive therapy does, I believe. So Freud's psychoanalytic method used introspection to arrive at insight. Interestingly, he never used that word insight. He wrote in German. He didn't write that in German. So Freud wrote about working through. And working through is a very interesting concept. Now, Donald Winnicott, again, going back to Giselle after his lovely presentation, he talked about the holding environment. That's not an accident that he would imagine therapy as a holding environment. He worked with young children. And the holding environment allows both the child and the parent, as you so well expressed with that lovely video, the patient and the therapist to play. Play doesn't mean something not serious. Play is very serious. I have a 3.5-year-old daughter. I have 2 families, 3.5-year-old daughter. I say, she's a full-time baby. She's a full-time child. We are part-time parents. She is a full-time child. Her play is very, very serious indeed. So the holding environment allows parent and child, patient, therapist, call them what you will, to enter this space of play, which is a very serious place where we explore the possibilities of life. 5th lesson, we've lived through 100 years and more of invisibility. So I'd like to talk about the evolution of therapy. In the 19th century, a Swiss psychiatrist in Montreal wrote a famous book called The Discovery of the Unconscious. It was before Freud. It was a long story. And now in the 21st century, we're living in a time of diversity, decolonization, and above all, the concept of change. People want to be very pragmatic. They want to translate things into something that will make a difference. And yet, people remain invisible, especially the most vulnerable, children, perinatal work. Canada still doesn't have mother-baby units, mother-child units that I saw in London 50 years ago. This is really untenable. So children are always among the most vulnerable, because any vulnerable population you mentioned, the children and the women in that population are even more vulnerable than the men or the people with power, the adults. So I think we have to make visible what was invisible. Freud said that psychoanalysis is to make the unconscious conscious. The story of therapy is really a story of making visible what was invisible. Dylan Thomas, the famous Welsh poet, said, "Poetry must drag further into the clear nakedness of light, even more of the hidden causes than Freud could realize." Before him, Freud said, "Everywhere I go, I find that a poet has been there before me." Beautiful. So I want to talk about the myth of independence. You see in this cartoon, I get the feeling that there are other people inside me. So the myth of independence is the notion that we are individuals and that we can self-define ourselves somehow. As a social psychiatrist, I start with the group and go to the individual. I literally say to people, I can't see you, I don't know you until I know your context. So I don't start with what's your name, I start with, tell me about your family. And then I get to the individual. So really, I think the story of therapy is Freud deconstructed through revisions, radical critiques, and even revisioning. So radical critiques, including behavior therapy and cognitive therapy. When I trained in London in behavior therapy, we just didn't talk about mind, brain, any unconscious. They weren't unpleasant about it. They just said, well, we don't know what that means. Very operational. Adaptations. Child therapy is an adaptation. Brief therapy is an adaptation. What we used to call parameters in psychoanalysis. And then, of course, new applications. For example, my work with Richard Malik at Harvard in the Harvard Program of Refugee Trauma, what we call trauma-informed therapy. And of course, in expansions, couples, families, groups, even community therapy with the work of my friend Adalberto Barreto with integrative community therapy in Brazil. And of course, many revisions. Even in psychoanalysis, we have the interpersonal turn, the narrative turn, and so on. Related to this is the fact that we are social animals. My favorite American psychologist, with deference to my friend Steve Pinker at Harvard, is still William James, who in his Principles of Psychology said this. He said, "No more fiendish punishment could be devised than that one should be turned loose in society and remain absolutely unnoticed by the members thereof. We are gregarious animals with an innate propensity to get ourselves noticed and noticed favorably by our own kind." So it's really a tension between loneliness versus belonging. Dr. Kruger won a prize exactly for this theme, and I was very, very moved by that. We not only want to be noticed in society, but we suffer in isolation. Loneliness is a major issue that contributes to mental and relational suffering, and we have a shared need for belonging. Sixth lesson is about making meaning, making sense and doing good, and I think that's always related to the question of ethics. What is said and what is unsaid. People will tell you or show you what you need to know. That mother in the thing, I mean, I've seen that video before because I worked with Patricia Crittenden, who was an attachment specialist. She was a member of my service for a time. And you don't know how to look at that until someone points out to you that understands what you're looking at. So people will tell you, but you have to know how to listen. You have to know what to see. You have to know what to watch. It's not always obvious. Anthropologist Gregory Bateson said that sometimes people speak in metaphors that are meant. I worked with a woman whose husband was very abusive. She said, "I'm a rug," and she meant it literally. My husband walks all over me. Unless you allow yourself to get into the concrete meaning of these metaphors, it becomes very abstract. You have to bring it down to the human lived experience, le vécu, as we say in French. A Haitian therapist that I worked with in Montreal spoke to a Haitian mother in Creole, and he said to her, "I have understood everything that you have not said." Because she was voodooism, she followed voodoo, but it couldn't be said. It's not allowed to be said in public. So what do? You say things in code, or you don't say things that another person that knows your world will understand. And his communication to her was, I have understood everything you haven't said. The rest of us were flabbergasted. I mean, what gobbledygook is this? But when you entered into it, you understood how profoundly impacting that statement was. Since we're in Morocco, I want to quote a famous Sufi, Al-Nifari. If you do not witness what cannot be said, you will shatter what can be said. This is a profound truth. And by the way, the Sufis anticipated everything that Freud said, and much of what psychology and psychiatry and psychotherapy say. I'm a very big fan of Le Petit Prince, The Little Prince. Men have forgotten this truth, said the fox, but you must not forget it. You become responsible forever for what you have tamed. When you have a child, you're responsible for that child. I remember Oscar Lovas, who worked with autistic children and used prods. He used to shock them. He was, even in that brutal way of intervening, he was very aware that if you have a relationship to a kid, it's an ethical relationship. He justified what he did. I think it would be hard today, but this is the lesson that the Petit Prince tells us. So I believe in the face-to-face encounter. I think psychotherapy is face-to-face. Response and responsibility begins with that encounter. I am a reader of Emmanuel Levinas, who wrote that philosophy is first and above all ethics. Healing, holding, caring, and psychotherapy are founded on the ethics of face-to-face. As an example, I've recently written about the guru-chela relationship. I wrote an article reviewing the fantastic work of J.S. Necki, who was a pioneer of psychiatry and of psychotherapy in India. And I believe each society has a resource to construct its own psychotherapy. So I'm interested in a Moroccan psychotherapy, a Tunisian psychotherapy, an Indian psychotherapy, and then looking at overall patterns that may bridge them. I think we need to rethink Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The Russian poet Osip Mandelstam said, the people need poetry like they need bread. And he said that when he was starving in the Soviet Gulag. Viktor Frankl, who survived Auschwitz in the Holocaust, wrote about man's search for meaning. So we do need security, we do need food, but we also need bread, we need sustenance, we need emotional support, we need spiritual support. We need a collective to make life make sense. Final lesson, and on the seventh day the Lord rested. When is therapy over? The myth of closure, flow, and finally slowness in therapy. Freud said that therapy is over when the patient realizes it can go on forever. That's a very pragmatic definition. This is something called an asymptote in mathematics. You put in more and more for less and less. When you get to that point, it's time to stop and think about what you're doing. And there is no closure. This is a very popular concept in American culture, especially in North American culture. This is a myth. You talk to people that go to court, that have their day in court, that they complain about the world. It's just a choice to get on with it finally. Leo Szilard, who felt very badly about contributing to the Manhattan Project as a physicist and the creation of the atomic bomb, wrote 10 Commandments for a Better Life. One of them is this: do your work for 6 years, but in the 7th, go into solitude or among strangers, so that the memory of your friends does not hinder you from being what you have become. So Ludwig Wittgenstein wrote something that looks like a joke. Question: how does one philosopher address one another? Take your time. Ludwig Wittgenstein would be in his Cambridge rooms with students. Sometimes he would take 5 hours with the students waiting there in silence as he looked out the window looking for the exact word to say. Now he's an extreme of this, but it's very similar to the psychoanalyst waiting for 50 minutes, or maybe never say anything at all, but waiting for the right moment, the right choice in the interpersonal encounter of when to intervene. Take your time is, I think, the best advice we can share. So in my Slow Thought Manifesto, I said we need a philosophy of slow thought to ease thinking into a more playful and porous dialogue about what it means to live. So in conclusion, I'd like to offer you 3 words. Holding is the key word for psychotherapy. Attachment is the key word for child psychiatry. And belonging is the key word for social psychiatry. Belonging is the social psychiatry. What attachment is the child psychiatry. Belonging is the glue that holds together the social determinants of health and mental health and gives them structure and meaning. Holding is the glue that binds introspection to insight and a relational act of empathy and witnessing. When we work with traumatized people, with anyone really, but especially traumatized people, they need above all an empathic listening and a witness to their experience. That is healing in itself. What to do after is a technical question. The first thing we need is this relational ethic of giving space and time to be a witness to the person's story. The philosopher Martha Nussbaum, in her chapter in her book about Winnicott, she put it as the highly particular transactions that constitute love between two imperfect people. And again, the image of the mother and the child. So, to summarize, first, people don't want to change, and we can call that resistance, we can call that homeostasis. Second, different therapeutic temperaments see different tasks and seek different ways of doing therapy. Third, families are unique cultures that require a relational approach, a different psychology, a relational psychology. Fourthly, therapy opens new vistas of life in a holding environment. Because if you don't have that safe space, that holding environment, that space for reflection and respect, nothing else can happen. The person's too anxious. The person's not going to trust you to do things. I remember the story. I prescribed something for, early in my career, I did some adult psychiatry. And I asked this middle-aged woman after 3 months if she was having side effects of the medication, if the medication is really working. And she said, oh, but I never took that medication. I said, not really. She said, I have it in my purse in case I need it. So it was effective as a backup. So we need to ask questions, and that's very important. That's part of the holding environment. 5, therapy makes visible the invisible. As social elements, we thrive in social contexts, we suffer in isolation, and independence is a myth. 6, people seek meaningful lives. And finally, slow therapy respects the flows and rhythm of life, takes time to integrate change, and knows when to stop, just like I should do now. And please, don't forget to play. I'd like to thank very much Chris, Cesar, and the International Federation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation and for this travel across these 7 lessons. Just to remind you something, when I became a still young professor, I asked for advice to one of my mentors. The answer was not, take your time. The answer was, take care of your children. So, good program. There are 8 lessons, 9th lessons, and so on. Thank you very much. You have questions to Professor de Nicolas? For sure. Yeah, vas-y. Yeah. Micro.
It's not a question, it's a comment. Vincenzo, as usual, it was a pleasure to listen to you. I mean, social psychiatry is so extremely important to be bridged with psychotherapy and vice versa. It cannot go otherwise. It can't be. It can't be. And even when people think that Freud was constantly and permanently thinking on to one person, he was not. He was constantly thinking of the context. When a child having a school phobia was taken by him personally to the school every day because he knew the school is important, and when he had all these items from ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, and he thought of history of human beings in parallel with the history of humankind. So he was constantly and permanently thinking to the individual in the context. And this is why I think we cannot be a social psychiatrist without being a psychotherapist and vice versa. I think that what you're doing in showing is very important.
Thank you very much. Well, I completely agree, of course, and I think that one of the 3 branches of social psychiatry, after epidemiology and public health, community psychiatry, is what I would call the relational therapies. And even psychoanalysis has a relational component. And I agree with your take on Freud. Freud was extremely aware of social context, culture, and so on, in history. but it sometimes was reduced in ways that are not fair to the entire, Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Any other questions? Cesar?
Just a comment. Thank you so much for that tour de force. I mean, it was really inspiring, and I hope that the younger members of the audience appreciate it as much as I did. A comment related to belonging, because I think it's such an important topic. It took me to a chapter that I recently read in a book on affects and suicide. And the beauty of that particular observation it was actually by a group of Singaporean authors, is that, instead of paying so much attention to the isolated affects that traditionally we associate with suicide, like sadness or hopelessness, there's a movement now to try to look at the complex affective states. And one of them that's highly associated with suicide is the notion of thwarted belongingness. And it ties so beautifully with the original studies of sociology and suicide and what you're promoting here. So I appreciate the resonance. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, and this really merits an ongoing conversation. But let me just point something out. The history of emotions is a new topic in history. So I have a friend called Rob Bodice, B-O-D-D-I-C-E. It's a plug for him. Brilliant young man. I think he's still in his 40s, published many books. He's really opened a new chapter in history on the history of emotions. And, it's shocking. You think about, well, isn't that psychology? Isn't that psychiatry? Isn't that psychotherapy? A little bit, but not enough. So he's precisely creating a context for this kind of observation. Thank you for that, and I encourage people to read Rob Bodice, very accessible, brilliant young historian. I believe my friend Mustafa. Present yourself, Mustafa.
Thinking, because when I heard you talking about how it works with psychiatry, I was thinking of it just dropped me back to what Ibrahim Asso was saying about la structure anthropologique de la personnalité chez l'Africain, the anthropological structure of personality in the Africans, which is guided by the relation with the individual, with the community, and with the ancestors, and how it binds it. And whenever there was a problem he used to say madness of mental health issues, how the community had their technical aspects to relink, to reconcile the person and give belonging to the personality. A lot of traditional therapy at that regard that people used to do and used to work on is to give to the person back a sense of belonging. And I think that there's a lot to be done. You were discussing with me yesterday and said that maybe in sub-Saharan Africa there's not many people working on social psychiatry, but I believe that at the traditional level there's a lot of things to be done, and I think that we should be thinking on how to put that together. Thank you.
There was a very interesting symposium asking the question, should we adapt psychotherapy culturally? And I think that's a very important question, and some interesting answers were explored. But before that, I think we need to ask, if we talk too much about culture as a technical aspect, we lose what I think you're saying, which is the real issue with culture is we need to redefine how we see the person. As I say, I start with a group, and then I get to the individual. Most Western psychology, Western Northern epistemology start with the individual and then radiate out, like going out instead of going in. And I think that's fundamental, and I think even people who are very dedicated to working with culture don't usually identify that particular problematic. But thank you for your intervention.
Thank you very much, and now it's my pleasure to introduce the last speaker in the session, Dr. Cesar Alfonso. Dr. Alfonso is clinical professor of psychiatry at Columbia University, adjunct professor at the University of Indonesia, and visiting professor at the National University of Malaysia and at Prince of Songkla University in Thailand. Born in Cuba, he spent formative years in Spain and Puerto Rico before pursuing undergraduate studies at Yale and then graduate and postgraduate studies in medicine, psychiatry, and psychosomatic medicine and psychoanalysis in New York. He served as president of the American Academy of Psychodynamic Psychiatry and Psychoanalysis in 2010 to 12, and also a chair of the psychotherapy section of the WPA for 6 years, and presently, actually he served more than on the council of the International Federation. As of yesterday, he is the president of the World Federation for Psychotherapy. His recent work includes the study of psychodynamic determinants of treatment adherence, biopsychosocial and cultural aspects of suicide, clinical care of visually impaired persons, and design and implementation of psychotherapy training programs worldwide. Professor Alfonso is a distinguished fellow of the APA, American Psychiatric Association, and a fellow of the New York Academy of Medicine, the Academy of Consultation Liaison Psychiatry. He has over 100 publications, including 3 books. He practices in New York and is chief psychiatrist at the Lighthouse Girl Clinic. He's the editor-in-chief of Psychodynamic Psychiatry. I must say that actually I got to know Alfonso during the recent months more closely through the Federation, and I'm just so impressed with the work he has been doing, following in the footsteps of Professor Musavi is very difficult. And yet, one day, he really has shown that he will do a great job in the coming years. So, Professor Alfonso.
Good morning, and thank you for being here. As you can see, this is the new logo of the organization. It's the first public display, so. That's the most important part of my presentation. I will carry you through a very brief lecture on a very complex topic, and hopefully I'll be able to simplify the concepts without oversimplifying it, talking about the link between childhood adversity, epigenetics, and psychotherapy. So these are some very ambitious learning objectives: to understand how childhood trauma changes gene expression through DNA methylation. We will review recent research evidence suggesting that there's a sensitive period for epigenetic programming, and contrast that with the recency and accumulation models, and hopefully I'll have time to explain the difference, and understand the relationship between epigenetic changes and psychotherapy as a biological treatment. So I'm getting ahead of myself here. I summarize for you in this slide the giants of the journey trying to connect neuroscience with psychoanalysis and with psychotherapy. Just yesterday, Dr. Kandel, who's turning 93 years old, was honored at Columbia University. I saw a lot of photographs in social media and wish I could be in 2 places at the same time, but we had a better time at our party last night than in Dr. Kandel's retirement party. If you are interested in the topic, I can give you more references if you write to me, but these are, classic, important books and articles. So the ACE study, I think, is one that everyone should be familiar with. It really changed, the results of this study really changed the way I approach treatment with my patients and families and patients who are having children. The hypothesis of this study, or series of studies, is that negative life experiences in childhood have negative health outcomes in adulthood. I think this was a reasonable hypothesis that we sort of knew what the results were going to be, but the details of the results is what matters the most. So they looked at emotional, physical, sexual abuse, what we classically thought of as, the adverse childhood experiences, but also witnessing domestic violence, witnessing drug use in the household, and other events. And I think that this is a key element. And the finding is that adverse childhood events correlate with adult mental health disturbances, such as depressive anxiety disorders and addictions. But surprisingly, one of the important findings is that these experiences also correlate with terrible health outcomes. Somatic illnesses in general, obesity, hypersexuality, sleep disturbance, suicide in a follow-up study, all of these were directly linked to having adverse childhood experiences. What I think is the most important aspect of this study in terms of changing the way we think is that what they found is that the cumulative effect was actually more important. So it's really not the particulars, the specifics of the type of stressor, but how much of it is happening. And then later on, hopefully through this presentation, we'll qualify that further by understanding that it's not so much how much of it is happening at the same time, but when is it happening? What are the vulnerable periods? So, this is just to give you some a sense of how prevalent these adverse experiences were. And this is a study conducted in the United States with thousands and thousands of patients. It's quite tragic to look at these numbers. And in terms of the results, early trauma and illness later in life, it increases the risk of depression by almost 3 times, PTSD by over 4 times, anxiety disorders, and so on, alcoholism, use of illicit drugs, but also an association with diabetes, independent association with diabetes, with stroke, and with premature mortality. So how does this happen? What is the pathogenesis? How do we get from the adverse childhood events to ill health later in life? So there are different ways of understanding this, and I listed here some of them that may be familiar to you. There's a lot of attention lately to inflammatory markers like interleukin-6 and looking at the correlation of inflammatory markers with depression. Later at the very end of the conference, I'm giving a talk looking at the bidirectionality between inflammation, illness, and depression. If you take something like glaucoma, for example, in a person who's visually impaired, and you look at the connection between glaucoma and depression and what happens when you treat glaucoma and depression, there's a less problematic depression, and what you treat when you treat depression, the prognosis of glaucoma improves. So, and then we're trying to look at the common link, and inflammatory markers are a possible link. But there is, and you're familiar with some of these other pathogenic pathways. But now we're paying attention as well to DNA methylation and epigenetics, and we will define what that is. So epigenetics is the alteration of gene activity without changes in the DNA sequences. So it's sort of what happens peripherally to the DNA. Joanna Chambers, who's a psychoanalyst and past president of the American Academy of Psychodynamic Psychiatry, said, and I quote, "Epigenetics is the underlying mechanism for all neuroscience and behavior." That's, quite an absolute statement, coming from a psychoanalyst, a psychodynamic psychiatrist. Epigenetic processes occur mainly through DNA methylation and acetylation. But there are other pathways as well, but research is focusing on DNA methylation. And we know that DNA methylation is triggered by toxins, pollutants, bacteria, viruses, radiation exposure, nutritional changes, hormonal exposure, and environmental stressors. And I think that this is the part that concerns us. So this changes, the beauty of this in terms of our work is that epigenetic processes may be reversible. So I'll get ahead of myself and tell you that psychotherapy can reverse these epigenetic changes. Epigenetic processes are heritable by offspring. So that may be a plausible explanation for what we've been calling the intergenerational transmission of trauma. The interactions between acute trauma, enduring stressors, emotions, hormonal and peptide surges, up and down regulation of receptors and neurotransmission cause epigenetic changes in the brain with associated changes in endocrine and immune systems and inflammatory response. So this basically tells us that inflammation, all of this may be linked. So we may not need to look at one pathway as the primary pathway for pathogenesis. So, unfortunately, epigenetic changes often remain stable through life, but they may be altered and reversible through psychotherapy and with psychosocial and environmental interventions. In genomics, there is a paradigm shift. We no longer think of the linear link between genes and disease. We're beginning to look at what's been called gene by environment interactions. And another psychodynamic psychiatrist from Austin Riggs, Eric Blaken, said, and I quote, "Gene by environment interactions is really just another way of saying biopsychosocial." So here we have, a metaphor that we've been using that has been guiding our thinking, connecting to an allied field in genomics. And DNA methylation may play a role in mental disorders. So what is DNA methylation? It's the addition of a methyl groups of cytosines in the DNA sequence. It can alter gene expression, providing a mechanism by which gene by environment interactions affect biological responses. If you look at DNA methylation and you look at when it happens, there may be more damage to the DNA or enduring damage. And this is what's meant by the sensitive period, the model. So the sensitive period of development, we understand is, if you look at it, what attachment theorists conceptualize, when I started reading about attachment theory, the sensitive period of development was up to the school years. And the more research that is done, the closer and closer the sensitive period of development gets to the time of birth. So now what I tell my patients, how do we translate this clinically? Adults who are, I don't treat children, adults who are planning a family, I tell them that they have to be in their best behavior as parents from the moment they get pregnant to the first 6 months of life, and then they can relax. And, they look at me as if I'm nuts because that's the most difficult time to be, in your best behavior. But, it's an important message that we need to send. It's important in terms, for example, of in places that grant paternity leaves, for fathers to be there and to be on during the sensitive period of development. And then I reassure the parents that they can, sort of relax themselves a little bit until adolescence, and that's the second sensitive period of development. And in terms of the epigenetic changes that we're observing, we see that more damage is done to the DNA during those two particular periods. And this is on top of the accumulation model, which is one familiar to us in psychiatry. The more stress over life, the more psychopathology. So, again, very logical. But when I show you the graphs of what actually happens to the DNA, you'll see that what happens during the sensitive period of development in order of magnitude is extraordinarily worse than what happens even with the accumulation model. And the recency model,
which is, a way to define the recency model is when you document the history of breast illness, when you're reporting a case, we pay so much attention to what happens right before the patient becomes symptomatic. That's important, but it tells you only maybe 10% of the story that we can connect with the prognosis. Most of the story is what happens early in life, during adolescence. What second aspect in terms of order of magnitude would be accumulation, and least important, the recency model. This is just a pictorial representation of DNA methylation, and you can see the color difference, in the three-dimensional model, just to show you that this is happening at the periphery of the DNA without changing necessarily the structure. And an important article that I recommend everyone reads in biological psychiatry, relatively recent, is the one published by Don and colleagues at Harvard. I'm not going to go through the details here, but basically the results is that the effect of adversity on DNA methylation depends primarily on the developmental timing of exposure. So, again, proving what I've been summarizing for you. And exposure in very early childhood was associated in DNA methylation differences for nearly all adversity types. So the conclusion was that when adversity occurs early in life, it coincides with the initial and foundational sculpting of brain architecture. This is like a glorious moment for psychoanalysts who've been talking about the importance of, eliciting a good childhood, early childhood history. It's so difficult to get information from patients as to what happens during early childhood. But, you can ask them about, for example, I tell trainees, it's very important to ask the patient, can you describe the most challenging times throughout your life? And then you go from the general to the specific. Very early in life, what were the greatest difficulties that you and your family encountered? So, and then the patient will be able to reconstruct the history without necessarily having to remember the details. So look at the pictorial graph here showing, obviously, on one side, the sensitive period and the levels of DNA methylation compared to, on the right side, to the accumulation theory and the recency model. So, obviously, very early in childhood trumps everything else. And, you have the different types of adversity here. Very, very elegant study that, really changed the way that I think about all of this. As early as 1999, Kandel asserted that insofar as psychotherapy is successful in bringing about persistent changes in attitudes, habits, and conscious and unconscious behavior, it does so by producing alterations in gene expression that produce structural changes in the brain. So we've been thinking about this for a while. Psychotherapy is a type of treatment that involves learning from the environment, working through transferences and the therapeutic alliance. So DNA methylation occurs in response to trauma or other early adverse experience. DNA methylation can lead to either gene silencing or activation. Epigenetic programming early in life could set up lifelong behavioral trajectories. Now, epigenetic changes and psychotherapy. Psychotherapy recalibrates sensitivity to the social context and environment. So the hypothesis of many studies after this finding is that as the environment produces biological changes that result in epigenetic modifications, psychosocial interventions can have a similar effect. So psychotherapy can demethylate your DNA. A systematic review by Jimenez and Luyten groups in separate institutions, South America and in the UK, looked at, summarized all the recent research that has been done. And I'll take you through this quickly. So this is a study of patients with borderline personality disorder. And it showed that compared to control, subjects with borderline personality disorder have a significantly higher state of methylation. in both regions of a particular gene that has been associated with the disorder and psychopathology, and those who responded to treatment showed a decrease in the percentage of methylation. The intervention was DBT for 4 weeks. Very short interventions and documented changes at the level of the DNA. Another study looking at agoraphobia symptomatic reduction, demethylation after 6 weeks of CBT. Another study looking at PTSD responders to prolonged exposure therapy showing decrease in DNA methylation. So this is completely transdiagnostic and trans-theoretical. Doesn't matter which type of psychotherapy, if it's a short intervention, if it's a longer intervention, more intensive, for as long as it is well delivered, patients improve symptomatically. As we know, the effect size of all psychotherapies is quite similar, but there are changes that are occurring at the level of the DNA that correlate with that. A study in children, I think the only one I could find in children, 12 weeks of CBT for anxiety disorders in children resulted in decreased methylation in particular gene regions. Another study, 6 weeks of CBT and a study of medication combined with psychotherapy, 6 weeks of CBT, improving, demethylating in patients with major depression. And this is a more recent study looking at the impact of trauma-focused psychotherapy for PTSD in soldiers. Successful treatment of PTSD was accompanied by significant changes in DNA methylations in 12 different regions in genes. So now we're beginning to identify regions in different genes that correlate with psychopathology. This is well documented, and now we're linking that to our interventions. And an intervention that has been carefully studied are the evidence-based psychotherapies. So I believe this is my last slide. Future directions and research questions. So what do we do with all of this, and your ideas will be welcome, and your research even more welcome. And these are some questions that I pose. Does DNA methylation of peripheral tissue sample, blood cells, adequately correlate with DNA methylation changes in the brain? The way DNA methylation is being examined is that you take a blood sample, you look at blood cells, the DNA is the same in all of our cells. So you look at those particular regions in the DNA in the peripheral tissue sample, and we are assuming that the changes that we're detecting peripherally in the DNA are changes that are occurring also in the central nervous system. But that is an assumption. The psychotherapy effects go beyond DNA demethylation, involving other epigenetic processes such as acetylation, histone modification, etc. Not we, because I'm not doing the research, I'm just summarizing it for you, but the community became so excited with these findings that there is sort of like an obsessive repeating of the looking at methylation, but I think other pathways, epigenetic pathways, need to be examined. There is a need to study complex relationships between gene environment, and gene cultural interactions. So we need to go beyond, the populations that are being studied in the high-income countries. And we need to study DNA methylation changes in the high dose, what I call the high dose psychotherapies, not to say psychoanalysis or psychodynamic psychotherapy, the intensive psychotherapies, the patients with complex treatment resistant. I also don't like the term treatment resistant, because the patients are not resistant to the treatment, or treatments fail the patients. So people with complex comorbidities, our typical patient that require longer treatments than what is offered in the research arena. So we need to look at what happens in DNA methylation with the longer treatments. And I have many references that I could share with you, and all you need to do is email me. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Cesar, for a really amazing presentation. I think this whole session, I must say, has been one of the best sessions I've ever attended. I've learned so much from this, and thank you really for a great talk. I have a quick question. This is similar to the question that I asked Professor Apter earlier. If we could improve the things considerably from the time of conception through first 6 months of life, we will be able to actually prevent schizophrenia, and not totally prevent, but markedly reduce the incidence of those. And there has never been talk about primary prevention of illnesses. But I think this is something where these are social determinants of health, where we can do something. And again, your work on showing how psychotherapy can change DNA methylation, it's really very impressive.
No, I thank you for that question. I think it's so important that we focus not only our research but our interventions, that we treat people, we offer treatment during the vulnerable periods of development. So we're telling the parents you have to be in your best behavior during the vulnerable periods. We need to tell ourselves the same thing. We need to target these populations. You know, we need to focus on very early childhood and adolescence as populations that are at risk. I mean, a lot of what I presented here is very preliminary. You know, Thomas Schulze from who said geneticist at the WPA, the first time that he heard me talk about epigenetics, you know, he said, well, you cannot be so categorical because this is just so new and it's new research, it needs to be replicated, we need to sit with it a little bit more. You know, so I'm presenting this as a caveat, what stimulates my thinking is that it correlates so well with the way we've been trained. You know, all of our theories have developed from observation, and now we're able to link that to hard science of something that is measurable, and to be able to explain to a parent, attachment theory shows that the sensitive period of behavior, to be able to have that conversation and then present data that is tangible to them, I think can be quite helpful. So yes, we need more research. We have no answer to the questions that you're posing, and we as therapists need to be on our best behavior during those vulnerable periods.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Cesar, for your wonderful talk. Very, very, very enlightening. There was a child psychiatrist in France in the 1970s who used to say that adult psychiatry is a branch of child psychiatry. And I find this beautiful. It's all consequences of what happened a long time ago. Giselle Apter here and myself, we were friends of a fantastic man who died 14 years ago, Leon Eisenberg. Great man. And in the 1970s and 1980s, he used to say there is nothing possible in psychiatry than the biopsychosocial model. Nothing. And it's so intertwined and linked one to the other that you can change the situation, you can improve the patient wherever you have an action, being biological, being psychological, psychotherapy, or being social. So, and of course, the best is to have a good impact on the three components. And when I say this, I mean, when we say social, it's also cultural, it's also religious, it's also spiritual, and so on and so forth. So I mean, it's really a huge hope to know that wherever you touch, if you do the right thing on these three components, then you improve the patient.
Did you want to answer? I want to say something that's very complimentary to what Professor Mostawi said. That I'm a child psychiatrist, and this is the best child psychiatry talk I've heard in a long time. Because I think Exactly. That's the point. That's so interesting. So it really looks like there's an emerging theme here. I think you've done an incredible synthesis of important work in neuroscience, obviously with the foot in the psychotherapies, but especially concentrating on early life experience. I think this is just wonderful. Once upon a time, I followed a child psychiatrist I won't mention which university, who wanted to found the whole department based on attachment theory and early infant development. He was literally run out of town. I mean, he didn't finish his term. I arrived after him, and I tried not to make that mistake. But I think that, in fact, Driss is right, you're right, we really need to spend a lot more attention on that. And Giselle was bemoaning what she understood Professor Sartorius to say, that certain aspects of perinatal health are not part of psychiatry. Is that what you understood him to say? I didn't hear him that way, but that's interesting. So this is really brilliant. So my question is this. Not only are you offering a different way to reimagine nature-nurture and a whole language for relation among these factors, I think even more profoundly, this work, your approach to it, suggests that the thing itself is in question. Remember, we had a conversation about diagnosis. I think DSM has reached an asymptote. Like, more and more refinements are not going to get us to a better place. So we need a new language. But the language isn't just a way of icing on the cake. We need a whole new cake. So in other words, this suggests not only do we have a different attitude about, not only does epigenetics change the way we think about these relationships, it changes what we're studying. So maybe we shouldn't study oppositional defiant disorder or bipolar disorder or whatever. Maybe we should be studying the equivalent of what, Roberto Luis Fernandez did with the cultural formulation interview, a social determinants of health, and ACEs interview that grabs that, and then the diagnostic criteria and concepts just disappear into something much more important and fundamental. That is really, I think, the heart of your message that I'm going to take home. Thank you very much.
May I respond? Thank you. You brought up so many different points, and I could probably address this in 3 or 4 different lectures. But I'll say something complementary and in addition to what you proposed. And it relates to a study that has been lost to our awareness, looking at comorbidities. I'm a strong believer that our most difficult patients are our ordinary patients, not the research subjects. I recently sat on a panel where I was saying what is being tested in research is not real-world psychiatry and psychotherapy. We never see a person in our offices who has only major depression. They also have personality issues. They have an anxiety disorder or 2, and they have PTSD. So here we have 4 or 5 different diagnoses, and no research or very little research is being done looking at the impact of all treatments, including medication, on this typical patient that we see in our offices. I learned this when I was doing research at Columbia, same time that you were at Columbia, and I was recruiting subjects for a study. The most difficult part of the process of doing research was finding the subjects that were purely depressed. I had to screen hundreds of patients, and I'm sorry, but you're not good enough for our study. It was so frustrating. And then those who were recruited were so excited about being recruited that I think that most of the response was probably a placebo response anyway. So, obviously I did not follow the path of research in the conventional way. So I think we need to do more research. But the one particular study that, research in the comorbidities that I want to highlight here is something that has completely escaped our awareness. And if you remember DSM-4, and I am an advocate for descriptive psychiatry, so I'm not bad-mouthing DSM or ICD, I think it's very important that we remain within the boundaries of general psychiatry and embrace descriptive psychiatry. So we can have a dialogue to make it better, but I don't think we should do away with it. But DSM-4 had the axis 3, and the axis 3 was helpful in thinking of comorbidities of medical illnesses and psychiatric illness, the axis 1, axis 3 comorbidity. And there was this one study looking at the relationship between the GAF, the other axis, the global assessment of functioning, with the comorbidities. And to my surprise, axis 1, axis 3 comorbidity was much worse in terms of GAF than axis 1, axis 2. The personality disorder patients destabilize us so much in terms of our countertransference that we think of them as the most difficult patients, our sickest patients. But the ones that are being lost to our psychotherapy interventions are the patient with bronchial asthma and anxiety, or the patient with lupus and depression. You know, much worse GAF than if someone who has borderline personality and axis 1. So I'm saying this almost complementary to the other things you raised.
Okay. Thank you both for everything that sort of, it seems like we each have, we're pieces of puzzles of or more like it's an impressionist kind of, and we're getting the picture more and more by stepping back rather than sticking our nose right in the middle of a detail. But I just wanted to, it's a few comments rather than a question. One is to add on to what Dries said, because we generally have a joke between ourselves mostly, but sometimes with our colleagues, especially since I do a lot of CL in maternity wards and pediatrics, is that not only is adult psychiatry a branch of child psychiatry, but the whole of medicine is a branch of psychiatry, given what we know about adverse events and the issue of comorbidities, which is another point. That's also something that I want to comment on. For very young children, as you know, again, agreed with you, we need classifications only, and this first and foremost in a pragmatic way, because our health systems need classifications to be able to give us money to take care of patients. But we shouldn't idolize these classifications, and remember that essentially for young children, they are not very good, to say the least, and that's a euphemism. We do have one, which is DC 0 to 5, which is pretty good for young children, and I'm not advocating, and I'm not part of the group. I just want to say, to comment on what you just mentioned, is that it has 5 axes, and one obviously has to do with children. That's the parent-infant relationship, axis 2. But axis 1 is diagnostic, and axis 3 is medical conditions, and axis 4 is all the stressors. We won't go into development because that's specific to children too. But even that means at least 3, if not 4, different ways to try to focus on the whole of the patient, and that's not even looking at 2s and 3s. That's just, so I think we would benefit by, I don't know if there's going to be a DSM-6, but by trying to, even if you stay inside categories, by at least trying to have some more information, and that might even be really useful to all our colleagues with who are taking care of people's other illnesses, and to know that they have the axis 3, and they know that there's an axis 1 and 4. I mean, there's a stressor and a diagnostic. And that way we can also learn to speak common languages, or at least to have a sort of score of languages that we can work together. And last but not least, about epigenetics, because epigenetics is obviously something that both we all psychotherapists look at, but parent-child people are I've been fascinated with Canada's work on animal models from back at the beginning of this century, Michael Meany, Philip Champagne, and to add on, really, really a light of hope for us is that not only does it help the patient or the next generation, if you're looking at both parent and infant, I mean, it will change the brain structure of the child, but then you don't have to do anything. You shouldn't neglect that person, but if that person stays in a normal environment without too many, you don't have to enrich something for the next generation. You're working for 3 generations, and that's really, really fantastic. Thank you.
I also want to remind people that the lunch hour is only 1 hour, so feel free to exit. If those who want to stay, you may want to stay.
Yeah, I'm Dorina from Berlin, from Germany, and I just wanted to thank you, Professor Afonso, that you always tell the parents to emphasize on the first 6 months. In Berlin we had, or in general in Germany, we had the experience, although we have a very good social system, that we had many crucial cases where children died despite being in the social system. So what we did is we formed in the Charité, it's our greatest hospital, right, in Germany. We formed this, it's called the Center for the Protection of the Child. And what we did is we decided to collaborate with social workers and psychologists and psychotherapists in the field, and we formed like projects that accompany women, especially the mothers, for the whole first year from 9 to 3 o'clock, from 9 in the morning to 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and they're being with well, not me, with my colleagues. And what we saw is that the children they had in that time, these children that they brought, they had a much better outcome in schools later, and also before in the kindergarten, because many of them, they had 2 or 3 other children before, and those children, they suffered from so many mental diseases, right? So I just wanted to like make a case for collaboration, not to like just think about hospital or stuff.
Thank you so much. You know, when I tell parents they have to be on their best behavior, they become overwhelmed and say, well, how do I go about it?
It's too much.
Well, a way to go about it is to accept help and to surround themselves with caregivers as much as possible. So this is good. If someone is ambivalent about engaging in additional caregiving and they feel guilty that, you know, they should be able to do it on their own. After all, they invested so much in the decision of parenting, et cetera, et cetera. We're all familiar with this process. You know, you can use some of this data or try to weave it into the conversation to explain to people that there is an imperative, you know, to optimize caregiving, in particular during these periods. And then I also use the example that when the child goes up to school, there are going to be plenty of caregivers and plenty of additional attachment figures, you know. So, but their job, you know, when they're going to be primary caregivers, really occurs during the preschool years, and they should have the best they should create the best possible environment by accepting the help that may be available to them, or that, you know, maybe we can help them network so that they can obtain it, like your program and your propositions.
Thank you very much. Again, it's a great session.